One thing that's always confusing about speaking to a group, and I've never gotten over this, as many groups as I speak to, the first thing that happens is you're introduced, but I don't know how to begin without introducing myself. So again, even though you already know it, my name is Annie Campbell. I love this topic, how does faith inform work? And this morning I've been asked to be here to talk about how faith informs my teaching and my lifelong career in public education. But I would encourage each of you to reflect as I speak on how God and your faith in God and your grounding in your Christian walk informs your work. Because it's a relevant question that begins with where we are now and is enriched by where we've been. So that's what I'll be talking about. Where I am now, you've got to start here. If you look at the Gospels, Jesus always says, what do you want right now? Not what have you wanted, what have your hopes and desires been, what are your dreams? Where are you right now? And I'll work backward from that. I started teaching almost 40 years ago. And I'll tell you, as a staff developer in RPS, I have a lot of first-year teachers that I'm speaking to. And when I say, I've been teaching for almost 40 years, or I'm 60, I always expect them to drop dead and say, you can't possibly be, and never yet has that. So, I'm 60 in the classroom, and that's a rare commodity. But what's even rarer than that is I'm still so excited about teaching, and I'm still learning how to be a good teacher. And I know every single day that there's a better way to do this, and I'm in active pursuit of what that is and what that means. Today, Mary Dean knows, but I'm just going to be completely transparent here because I'm going to talk about this. So, a month ago, my sister died, and I went to Mexico to take care of her. And that's part of what, when I talk about my classroom, you need to know that piece. I came back, and I fell, and I insist on saying I fell, because have you noticed what happens to the verb fall at around 60? You go from falling to having a fall. So I didn't have a fall, I fell. I fell and ended up with a detached retina, which is why I'm here without any eye makeup, which is like asking Superman to stand up and talk at first press with a block of kryptonite in his hand. I've not done this since I was 13 years old, so.
Well, you look great.
Thank you. All right, so that's the immediate, where am I now? I teach a class of third graders, and if I think about how God drops breadcrumbs for us to follow into our vocation, maybe that started in the third grade. Maybe it started when my sister and I played with Barbie dolls, and her Barbie doll wanted to be a nightclub singer. And my Barbie doll couldn't decide between Peace Corps and Vista. So maybe those were some breadcrumbs. Maybe there were some breadcrumbs when I was a senior in high school. And in my English class, I knew I would major in English literature and did. In my English class, our assignment was to tie together art, but not literature. Any form of art, but not literature, of an era that we liked and admired. So I loved my English teacher. He was good and kind and creative, and he thought outside the box. He introduced me to Flannery O'Connor. He introduced me to Citizen Kane. It was such an exciting and exhilarating class, and I knew that life was bigger and better because of him. So I wanted to give him a gift. It was the mouse on the doorstep that a cat might leave you. And I talked about the 19th century Impressionists. On this device, again, when I'm talking to first-year teachers, I have to explain what a Kodak carousel is. And that how I played the slides, and in the background, and again, I have to define a record player and a record, but I played Debussy, Rain in the Garden, while I talked about the 19th century Impressionists, and it was a gift for him. And this was 1973. Women could be and do anything, and I knew that he was going to tell me that one day maybe I'd be a senator or a Supreme Court justice, that I could be anything, I could do anything. And so I wasn't at all surprised when he said, Annie, can I see you after class? And I went up to his desk and I just waited. I waited for the sword to come upon my head and on each shoulder so I could be knighted for my life of success. What would it be? What would he tell me I could do? And this is what he said. He said, Annie, I have something to tell you. I see who you are. I knew this was coming, and I nodded, and I waited, and he said, Annie, you are a natural born teacher. And I burst into tears. I was so insulted. I couldn't believe it. Well, I went off to college, and I double majored in English and history. And I needed to beef up my GPA for law school. And I really needed to beef it up, and I started saying to people, wow, this isn't right, I need to get this higher, what should I do? And they said, take children's literature. It's an easy A. So I walked into that children's literature class, and I often wonder when I tell this story, could this woman have been from Richmond? But her name was Catherine Hook, and I do believe that she had been born in the previous century. And the first thing she said to us, if any of you are here for an easy A, I hope you'll think twice. And then she held up this blue book, the Anthology of Children's Literature, and she said, this is a treasure chest, and I'll be deeply hurt if I ever see it in a secondhand book sale. She said, open up this treasure chest at the table of contents and raise your hand if you've been exposed to this literature. And she went through folk tales and fairy tales and myths. She went through the legends of the saints. She went through epic poetry. And my hand went up, and it stayed in the air, and I looked around the room, and nobody else's hand stayed up as long as mine. And it wasn't because I had a wonderful education, though I did. It was because I had parents who read to me every single night. It was because I had a library card and a father who took me to the library every Saturday. It was because there were books that lined the shelves in our living room. Not just my living room, but the living rooms of my grandmothers. Both grandmothers. That is where I got my education. When people ask me, do I believe in homeschooling, I say absolutely. I was homeschooled after 4 every day, and that's how I believe in it now. I began to wonder that night how unfair that some children are exposed to this broad literature where they're asked questions that make them think, where their opinions are honored as mine were at my dinner table every night and those of my siblings, and that some children don't get that, and they don't get it at school. If you don't get it at home, you're probably not going to get that at school. And does it have to be that way? And it was that night when I had shown up in Catherine Hook's class for an easy A. It was inconvenient. I was a senior in college. I decided that I was going to be a teacher, that I would drop one of those majors, not English, that I would drop history, do student teaching, graduate a semester late, and I would become a teacher. Now, do you remember that Barbie doll who couldn't decide whether she wanted to be a VISTA volunteer or a Peace Corps volunteer? I applied for a job, and they said, we're going to give you the top first grade, because if you are cute, energetic, well-spoken, that's generally what happens. They're like, oh, we know you'll get along with the high-powered parents of these students. And I said, no, I don't want that. That's not why I became a teacher. And the principal said, well, we do have this poverty program, this Title I poverty program, but you probably wouldn't want that. And I said, oh, that's exactly what I want. That's why I became a teacher. Give me that other class when I'm tired, but I'm not tired yet. So that year was the first year that kindergarten became compulsory. And I became the teacher of children who had never been to kindergarten, of children who had their first pair of shoes in some cases. That first day, I turned on the faucet to wash some paintbrushes because, believe it or not, back then children painted in school. And I went to wash those paintbrushes, and the children got out of their seats and gathered around me. And I said, "No, wait a minute, you didn't raise your hand, you didn't ask to get out of your, what's happening?" And they weren't looking at me, they were looking at the water coming out of the faucet. It's hard to believe what's happened in the last 40 years in the state of Virginia. That wouldn't happen in that community now. Now, what was planned for those, I had 14 children and a full-time aide. What was planned for those children? A prescriptive, restrictive curriculum. Those children were not expected to learn more than 3 or 4 letters for a whole first semester.
Oh my goodness.
And with those letters, they would be taught the words cat, fat, is, am, I, and me. And they would arrange those words to make sentences that they could read. It's not what I had in mind that night in Catherine Hook's children's literature class when I decided to become a teacher. I couldn't believe that other children were learning to read in first grade and that these children weren't even expected to read. Well, I was a good girl and a first-year teacher, and I didn't want to lose my job. So I did that for as long as I could, about 4 weeks. And then I thought, how did I learn to read? Well, I went to school reading. No one ever taught me to read. Why would be the next question. Well, I was read to all of the time. And what else happened in my house? Well, my mother, I brainstormed. My mother let me stir when she made pancakes. Sometimes she let me lick the spoon when we made Jell-O. And I thought, well, I don't know why that worked, or why I ended up loving literature, or why I ended up loving to learn, but maybe it had something to do with stirring and licking the spoon. So I created a schedule where every child stirred and licked the spoon until everybody had done it, because it might have something to do with reading. I blew the world open for them. They'd never heard of Hansel and Gretel, and they made me tell that story over and over again. They couldn't believe there was a house in the woods made of gingerbread, that there was a stepmother that didn't love the father's children. They couldn't believe that children would be abandoned in the woods like that, and that there would be a witch that would pretend to be nice and turn out to be horrible. They couldn't believe that Hansel would be so clever to put out a chicken bone so the witch couldn't tell that he was not getting fat at all, or that he was getting fat, that he wasn't fat enough to eat, that that witch couldn't see. I couldn't believe that either till a couple of weeks ago with this adventure. I think of that witch. So I started telling fairy tales. I started telling folk tales. I started reciting poetry. I started teaching them to recite poetry. I started writing down what they had to say about stories. I brought more easels into the room and let them paint about the stories. And then the next year, this all continued. And the first year they learned to read more than they were expected to, but they didn't really learn to read. The second year, I was on it though. I had all summer to think and plan. And they gave me a child who was a selective mute. She'd been put in special ed. And they said, we think she's smarter than we can tell. Could she be in your class? Which was one step up from special ed. And I said, absolutely. And then around March, she went up to the board and she wrote without any permission, really. Back then, it was alarming if a child got out of their seat without permission. But she got up and she picked up a piece of chalk And she wrote, my name is, they knew how to write that, Peduh, P-E-D-U-H, Cottontail, C-A-I-N-T-A-L-E. I'd never asked my children to write anything. They were in first grade. They wrote what I wrote. Today is Monday. We have art. It will be fun. And I said, raise your hand if you all can write something. And they all raised their hands. And I handed out the paper. And they all wrote something that they wanted desperately to say. And I put it all on the bulletin board outside. And my principal came running down and said, you've got to take all that down. All those words are spelled wrong. And I said, but there's 6. So I got some yellow and black paper and cut. My hands were a blur. They were so busy. And I put it over their writing. It said, under construction. The 3rd year. And this is where God comes in. A child walked into my room. I'm telling you, I don't know what came over me, but I could not stand that child. Every time he talked, it was like fingers on the blackboard. And I knew I was not to react to a child that way. That whatever was going on, it was not his fault. And I thought, well, I'll love him by October, because I truly still believe that every child that walks across the threshold walks across the threshold for a reason. And it's my job to figure out why. And it begins by loving them. Well, October 1st, I still didn't love David Evans. And I went to, I'm an Episcopalian, I went to my priest and said, I really have a problem. There's a child in my class. I absolutely do not love him. The least I can do is love the children that are before me. Love my sheep, right? So he said, well, Annie, I just got back from this conference on healing, and I'd like to try something with you at the altar rail for communion. When I give you communion, imagine your arms around David Evans' shoulders, and I'll imagine it too. And I'll imagine Jesus around both of you, holding you. And take communion, and maybe it'll heal whatever it is. So we did that Sunday. And the next day, by now we're probably on October 3rd, David Evans walked in and I loved him, and I didn't give it another thought. I mean, I thought, that's amazing. Really, I should tell other teachers about this, but how do you, really? So I didn't, and I just went on. At Thanksgiving, we had our pilgrim hats, and we didn't call them Native American hats then, we called them Indian hats. So we had our pilgrim hats and our Indian hats on, and we made cornbread together and cranberry sauce, and I said, let's each go around and say what we're thankful for. I'm thankful for my new dog, Beezer. Someone else said, I'm thankful for the Smurfs. You can tell when this was. I'm thankful for Rainbow Bright. And we went all around, and then we got to David Evans, and I can still see him with the sentence strip stapled around his head and his feather. And he said, I'm thankful for the day you started loving me. So if there'd been any doubt before then that faith was tied with teaching, I didn't have any doubt from then on. And I knew I was to intentionally pray for my students. And that I believed wholeheartedly in the separation of church and state. But I knew that we could explore the bigger things in life together. By now, that poverty program ended. Politics changed, administrations changed, and this was the tail end of a Johnson poverty program. No, not when Johnson was president, but one of his programs. And so that program ended, it was disbanded. I had 5 years with those children and loved that program and learned so much from them because I could be so experimental. The expectations were so low that I could be so experimental, but the important thing is by being experimental, those children ended up on grade level by the time I left. The other very important story that deals with faith in that group is I had a child with no parents who lived with his great-grandmother and his great-great-aunt. And the grandmother was quite elderly and had a bad drinking problem, and a great-great-aunt had a lobotomy and colored in coloring books, and nobody in the house could take care of the child. And I started the proceedings, social services and all of that, to have him moved from his home. And he said, "But Mrs. Campbell, you told us that family is where people love each other, and you can't take me away from that house." And so we had to do some creative problem solving with social services. He did stay there. And that great-grandmother called me years later to let me know he was at Virginia Tech, which was an amazing journey from that high poverty class in that situation to there. Well, it was Miss Dulcie, then it wasn't Mrs. Campbell. I taught, I experimented, I loved what I was doing, I never stopped teaching. But the time came where I started doing some staff development, and I moved to Richmond because I married Ben Campbell, and I moved into this religious community where now I'm overtly not just reflecting privately about how faith affects education, but overtly. My role in praying for the city at Richmond Hill was not just 3 times a day in the chapel, but to go out and pray for the city with my work in the city, just as many of you are doing in so many different ways, but those of you that go to George Mason. I put my children at Fox, and the advice that I received was, whatever you do, don't tell anybody at Fox that you're a first grade teacher, because it'll be intimidating. I had a first grade. It'll be intimidating to the teacher, and just don't do it. I don't know why I followed that advice, but I went incognito. What I did was go into my son's class. I was a consultant, so I had some flexibility. I went to my son's first grade teacher and said, if you have a child who has a hard time learning to read, please let me tutor them. So I would tutor one child, teach them to read, move on to the next child, teach them to read, move on to the next child, teach them to read. And then I started reading to the class, and then we went on a field trip, and I volunteered for the field trip, and it got a little chaotic. We were walking to Sovereign Bank then, and the children were all over the sidewalk, and I couldn't stand it, and I finally just said, "All eyes on me. See this line in the sidewalk? Everybody stand one behind the other, and we'll sing on our way back to school. You are the line leader. Stop at the curb. Here we go." And we got back to Fox. Never even occurred to me I was taking over the class. And we got back to Fox, and the first grade teacher was out of breath, and she came up to me and she said, "I don't know what you want to be when you grow up, but you should really consider teaching." And I was so embarrassed that I'd kept that little secret, and I told her I was a teacher. She went right to the principal at Fox and said, "You've got to hire her. She really is a teacher." And he came up to me and he said, "I hear you're a teacher. Would you consider teaching?" "Oh, no. Very busy at Richmond Hill, very busy children, doing consulting. No, I'm not going back into the classroom." And he said, "Mrs. Campbell, you make great cupcakes, but I think you could make a bigger contribution to our school." Somehow he had me go with him to City Hall and then dropped me off and said, "They're waiting for you upstairs in Human Resources. They just want to talk to you about the possibility of a job." I went up there and they handed me a contract. And I said, "No, I'm not doing this. I can't do this. I have all of these things that I'm doing. I'm not going to put Richmond Hill at risk. I'm not going to put my marriage at risk. I'm not going to put raising my children at risk. I cannot do this. I will not be teaching for Richmond Public Schools," which is the other piece of advice I'd gotten when I left Fredericksburg. Don't teach for Richmond Public Schools. The head of Human Resources, who was a Presbyterian. And I said, "I know this isn't job interview talk, but I'm not interviewing for a job." This fine Presbyterian woman, African American, Leela Morris, leaned across her desk toward me. And she said, "I hear everything you're doing. And I know about Richmond Hill. In fact, I pledged to Richmond Hill. And this is what I have to say to you. God gives us the energy for that to which God calls us. And I believe God is calling you to teach in Richmond Public Schools.
Well, there it was. I'd been secretly discerning God's will in my teaching work, privately.
But here it was out in the open, at City Hall. Who could guess? And that's how I became a teacher in Richmond Public Schools. That's the best decision I've ever made. So, as I entered into this next phase, I began to see that teaching is not the content. The content is a doorway. And behind the content is another doorway. That's imagination. And behind that doorway, if we're teaching right, if we're teaching correctly, is a doorway that says metaphor. And behind that doorway is a doorway that says truth. And behind that doorway, you can take it wherever you want to take it. So if you're teaching the water cycle, you're teaching about the importance of water in the world. And behind that doorway, you're teaching about the water of life. And behind that doorway, you're teaching about quenching the deepest thirst. Not overtly. I don't say, boys and girls, today I'm going to teach you about quenching the deepest thirst. But it all begins to connect. We sit in a circle in my classroom every morning. It's pure liturgy. I don't care if my students become religious. I do care that they know there's deep good in the world. I don't care if they cure cancer.